Welcome to Facing the Future, brought to you by the Concord Coalition on WKXL, New Hampshire's talk radio station. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. Each week, we take a nonpartisan dive into topics related to the federal budget, the economy, and how it all affects our nation's future. This week, we'll look at the chances of a government shutdown at the end of this month and discuss two important legal fights over the constitutional power of the purse. And we'll also get some insights into what the bond markets may be signaling about the growing U.S. debt. Our guests are Rachel Snyderman, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Caleb Quakenbush, an Associate Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. Rachel and Caleb, welcome to Facing the Future.
Thank you for having us, Bob.
Great to be here.
Caleb, your first time on the show, so welcome. And did I pronounce your last name correctly?
It's Quakenbush.
Quakenbush. Okay, I wasn't sure, so I wanted to make sure. Okay, so Rachel, it seems like you and I talk about government shutdowns a lot when we are on the show. It always seems to be about when the government is going to shut down. So we're in that situation again. Kind of tell us where we stand. I mean, what's going on with the appropriations bills as we wind down the fiscal year?
Yeah, I'm always happy to come on, to talk. We just jump from each fiscal crisis to fiscal crisis. So thank you for, continuing to have me back. The worst kind of job security in Washington for sure. To give you where the state of play where we are, government funding will run out at midnight on September 30th for the current fiscal year. And we are not in a situation right now where lawmakers on Capitol Hill have agreed to how to fund the government for the next fiscal year, which starts on October 1st. And so what they are going to need to do between with the limited time left in the month and the days in session are to come together and pass some sort of negotiation. Now, whether that be all 12 appropriations bills, I think that is an extraordinarily tall order. However, Congress has done amazing things at the 11th hour, but what's most likely is that they will need to come together on a stopgap funding measure, which is known as a continuing resolution, which essentially funds the government for the next year at current levels. So really funding next year's government at the last year's funding levels. The devil's in the details there. Sometimes we have seen parties put certain riders or anomalies in there that can either accelerate or impede negotiations. And so we will have to kind of see where those negotiations continue to play out truly in the coming hours, let alone days and weeks ahead.
Yeah, any signals about whether it could be like a short-term punt into December or whether they'll try to do something longer? We're operating on like pretty much a 6 month CR. I mean, it went back to what, March or something like that?
That's right.
I mean, pretty much.
Right now we've certainly seen, in press reports, some hints that Democrats are more receptive to a shorter term CR, which would then buy them more time to find a true bipartisan compromise on a larger spending package before the end of the calendar year. What I think this is going to come down to are some of these policy considerations. There are some important provisions such as the expiration of expanded premium tax credits that were made for during the pandemic that expanded coverage in the Affordable Care Act marketplace for healthcare plans. Now, these premiums, these expanded tax credits expire at the end of the year. This could result in healthcare premiums raising for a significant number of households across the United States at the end of the year if lawmakers don't act on those expiring tax credits. So, look to see Democrats really want to have some sort of bipartisan negotiation around these expiring tax credits. Republicans still, figuring out how that will play. Of course, as we know, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that passed earlier this year in July, there were several changes made to federal healthcare programs, Medicaid, of course, being one of those, and a lot of those changes actually phasing in after the 2026 elections. And so, know that healthcare costs and, of course, rising costs households are facing right now is going to be a significant election issue this coming year. And so I very well think that this could be a major sticking point that we see in the negotiations to come. But whether this be a short-term CR or a longer-term CR that could play out into the next calendar year, either of those right now just create uncertainty for agencies as they're trying to plan. So, making sure that these negotiations continue on pace and are delivered before that September 30th deadline is what's paramount.
It seems like we don't do appropriation bills anymore. They just sort of get into this. And the downside of that is what? It seems to me instinctively that there is a downside of just doing these temporary or continuing resolutions without really going through the full appropriation process.
Yeah, I think it highlights the fact that the current budget process is in grave need of reform. We are in a situation where government funding actually, cannot happen without bipartisan support, given the slim margins that we see in Congress these days. And so I think that it kind of beckons that, because we can't get our basic budgetary homework done on time by passing 12 appropriations bills out of the House and the Senate before that annual deadline come around, it's time to rethink it, because right now, exactly that point. While continuing resolutions provide funding, which is essential because then that keeps the government open and operating, it still hampers service, the necessary planning and innovation that the federal government needs to be this, to uphold the strongest economy in the world. When you're essentially funding the government at last year's levels and not able to innovate and modernize, and in a time where there's extraordinary scrutiny on government efficiency and where tax dollars are going and ensuring that they're going towards the highest use, a lot of those conversations can't happen in a continuing resolution.
Yeah, you get maybe it does help in some sense control spending. On the other hand, it locks things in. And it may lock in good things and it may lock in bad things.
Yep. Exactly.
You're not doing. And just to be clear, the reason that we do need to have a bipartisan negotiation in some sense at the end is that they can ram something through in the House potentially, but in the Senate, appropriation bills can be filibustered.
Yes.
So it's not like a reconciliation bill. You can't get around it. So there will need to be Democratic votes at some point, which leads to the sort of discussions that you were thinking about or describing. So the president sort of threw a monkey wrench into all of these negotiations by sending up another rescissions request. So I want to talk a little bit about rescissions and impoundment and the power of the purse. There was an earlier rescissions request, which Congress adopted. And this is setting up another one. So what's the difference between what happened before and what's happening now?
Yeah, well, this is an extraordinarily important point to insert now for your listeners, because this is, again, like as I kind of noticed that some of the healthcare policy conversations that are going on, what happens with rescissions and government funding and the kind of the topic of empowerment are also going to be central to further negotiations on how the government will stay open or whether it will not. As you point out, the administration has leveraged a 1974 provision in the 1974 budget law, the Empowerment Control Act, that allows the president to request of Congress to cancel previously approved funding. Now, this is not the president being able to unilaterally cancel and rescind that funding. There's an orderly process by which the president makes that request of Congress, and then Congress has 45 days to approve said request. They exercised that authority back in July to rescind about $9 billion in foreign aid and public broadcasting funds. And we saw just last week the administration again utilized this process to rescind an additional $4.9 billion in foreign aid funding. Now, what is of contention right now is that subsequent request that came in last week came in within the window of 45 days left of the fiscal year. And this is a gray area, because the importance of this provision is that during that 45-day window, the administration is legally allowed to temporarily halt and freeze that funding. They do not need to obligate it and spend it as Congress deliberates whether or not they will approve that cancellation. But when you're within 45 days, well, the clock will run out on September 30th, and that money will still be withheld. And so that's the point where we have seen GAO in the past say that this is, in a 2018 opinion, say that this is unconstitutional. Subsequently, in a 2021 opinion, recognize that this is still bad, not in following the intent of the law, but that it highlights that the Impoundment Control Act requires updating to clarify what's going on known as pocket rescissions. And so this is where, ultimately we might see this end up in court challenges. But I think as we're thinking about this in the context of the current funding negotiations, is that this could really put a damper on the potential for bipartisan cooperation. If, for example, Democrats are wary that any bipartisan compromise that they come to this year could later be undermined by a subsequent rescissions package or a pocket rescission, very late in the next fiscal year. And so how
let's get back to that on the other. We're going to have to take a break there, leaving our listeners on tenterhooks here as we're thinking about what's going to happen with the pocket rescission. And we'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and my guests this week are Rachel Snyderman, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Caleb Quakenbush, Associate Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. And we've been talking about the pending shutdown, potential shutdown in Washington as we approach the end of the fiscal year. And Rachel, to get back to you here, you were describing something as a pocket rescission where the president has sent up a rescissions request, but there's less than 45 days left in the session. And the administration's position, as I understand it, is that means there's really nothing Congress can do. The funds are well, they could approve it, but I suppose they could disapprove it. But if Congress takes no action, the administration's position is those funds would automatically expire. And that's why it's called a pocket rescission, something like a pocket veto. My understanding is that it's being challenged in court. As you pointed out in the last segment, the Government Accountability Office has said that a pocket rescission is not in keeping with the Impoundment Control Act of the law. And so that's being contested in court, and it's probably going to be decided at some point by the Supreme Court. But how does it play into the budget negotiations? That you were beginning to talk about that on the other side when we took the break, but it is relevant to the budget negotiations that are going on.
Yes, it certainly is, because first and foremost, as we discussed, in the Senate especially, there is going to need bipartisan support and Democratic support to keep the government open and funded. We'll have to see kind of what that bill is that lands on their desks, but certainly some of this could be clouded if, for example, Congress chooses not to do anything on this rescissions package, or there's just the potential that more pocket rescissions could be coming, or that this is going to be a kind of normal point of order of the administration. I think a lot of concern that appropriations bills could be just the process itself of how Democrats and Republicans repeatedly come together to hash out their differences and make compromises when it comes to funding the government. A lot of that could be challenged if that process could be challenged if there is a kind of new norm of the administration kind of then coming in and choosing to propose for cancellation or rescission the funding that it doesn't support or doesn't like. And so that's really where, in the current state, there's a lot of pressure, especially on Senate Democrats. We saw some of this pressure play out in March, certainly for Minority Leader Schumer. I think what is different this time around too is that as we're thinking about the potential impact of a shutdown, that provides extraordinary power to the Office of Management and Budget, who is really tasked with overseeing the operations of the federal government when there is a lapse in appropriations. Right now, we don't have yet the clarity of how federal agencies would operate in a lapse of appropriations. Traditionally, they make these plans publicly available on their websites as well as OMB's websites. A number of those plans obviously have been updated to account for the changes in the federal workforce over the past months, but we don't yet have clarity on the majority of those plans. And so how the government would even operate in a shutdown is right now a big question mark. And I think that is something that is, again, kind of related to these other issues that have percolated, frankly, throughout the fiscal year, but of course are isolated given that we are within that 45-day window.
Well, it does, in my mind, raise a constitutional question. Again, the Supreme Court will tell us. But several years ago, the Supreme Court threw out the line item veto. There was a bill that was passed, and they did so because they said that the line item veto essentially allowed the president unilateral authority to change the law, and that wasn't in keeping with the Constitution. And the potential flaw here of the pocket rescission, it seems to me, is the same issue as to whether or not the president, by rescinding funds or withholding funds at the end of the year before they run out, before Congress has a chance to act on them, is in effect changing appropriation law unilaterally. And I think that's a hurdle that OMB will have to overcome in these court cases.
Yes, and one, I think rightly so, appropriators are wrestling with. The Constitution makes very clear that Congress holds the power of the purse. And, as we have seen that tested and played out, in real time this past year, I think no time are we going to see that more acutely considered and potentially challenged than in the days and weeks to come.
Well, I just make, before we move on to another constitutional power of the purse question, I would imagine that we, depending upon how this goes, might see appropriators write their language very strictly, being very precise about what they want to happen and when, and who's going to do it, and all that stuff. It may make for a different form of appropriations process.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, especially as we're thinking about, the composition of how some funding is awarded each fiscal year, some funding for multiple years, some funding never expires. So I think you are definitely hitting at something there, Bill, Bob, that we are, I've talked about this a lot with my colleague, Bill Hoagland, that we will be putting out some more work on in the coming weeks.
Okay, well, we'll be looking forward to that. Is going to be so. Moving now to a similar, I would say, a similar question in a way, in that we're talking about the power of the purse on the spending side, and whether the president has unlimited impoundment authority in effect at the end of the session. The administration has also been kind of pushing the envelope on tariffs, which is the taxing power, which is something also explicitly given to Congress. The Trump administration has been very aggressive about imposing tariffs. And Caleb, I want to bring you into the discussion because I know you've been following this pretty closely, and the BPC has been tracking how much tariff money has been coming in. I have to say, at the beginning of the year, I was rather skeptical about all this tariff stuff. I thought it was mostly for show, but the tariffs were actually imposed, and some big money actually began to start rolling in. So as we're approaching the end of the fiscal year, uh, how much money has been coming in, and specifically kind of relative to what we usually get from that source of income?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And yeah, that's a great question. As you mentioned, it's quite a bit of money relative to where we've been in the past. So we've been watching and tracking treasury statements as they're coming in each day, and then some of the monthly statements that kind of help balance out, some of the rebates and other duties that are being collected. But at the end of the day, government's collected about 150, 160 billion dollars in tariff revenue this year so far, and the last kind of high water market was around 2022, where we only collected about half that about the same time. And so you're talking about a doubling relative to some recent like high years. And it's certainly from a historical perspective, since we've migrated away from tariffs as our main source of revenue as a country to income taxes and corporate taxes and payroll taxes, a pretty significant increase. In fact, CBO came out with some analysis, I think, late last month, that we're basically on track for about $200 billion this year, which, as you say, is a significant sum of money. And then, of course, looking over the longer term, thinking about if these tariffs remain in place, and I'm sure we'll get into that with the court cases and everything. That's a big if. It could add up to about $3.3 trillion over a 10-year period.
That is a lot of money. Yeah, that was kind of an eye-popping number, and specifically because it was virtually the same as the cost of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that just passed. And I know the administration, the president, and others had been saying that the tariffs would bring in almost pay for the act or something, and frankly, I took that with an enormous grain of salt, and I still do. However, they do have this CBO estimate now saying that if the tariffs remain in place, you would bring in all that sort of money. We're going to have to take our second break here, and then we'll pick up on the other side because, as you say, there are some legal issues to the tariffs, and then we should put the money in context of the kind of deficits and debt that we're running. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Rachel Snyderman and Caleb Quakenbush of the Bipartisan Policy Center about the impending end of the fiscal year and some contest over the power of the purse in Washington. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I'm talking with Rachel Snyderman, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Caleb Quakenbush, Associate Director of the BPC's Economic Policy Program. Before the break, we were talking about tariffs, and tariffs have become a big source of income this year. You were saying, Caleb, I think you could get around 200 billion or something like that coming in this year. And the longer term projections from the CBO were over 10 years. If the current tariffs remained in place over that time, you could get upwards of 3 trillion, over 3 trillion, which is certainly a lot of money. Let's put the tariff income in context. I mean, it's fitting into, big projected budget deficits. How does it sort of fit into the big picture?
Yeah, so as you said, $3 trillion is not small potatoes. But yeah, I think you did a great job of setting this up just earlier. So at the start of this year, CBO each year comes out with a baseline where they're kind of looking 10 years ahead and looking at where debts and deficits are headed based on current law. And what they say is we're running right now about $2 trillion deficits each year and rising, or about 6% of GDP. And then of course this year we had the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that extended a lot of the tax cuts and added some new ones on top of it. And so we had this potentially $3 trillion source of revenue coming in over the years, but then we have this $3 trillion tax cut. So essentially where we are now is back where we were, kind of at the start of the year with projections. And of course, that's making a lot of assumptions about both the economy and about how these tariffs unfold. But the reality is, $200 billion ish a year is, maybe 10% of the deficit. So not small, but also based on the trajectory of where we are of, again, that $2 trillion is supposed to rise, in the years ahead. It's certainly maybe helping slow down deterioration of our fiscal position, but it's not enough to certainly overcome it.
Yeah, and there are some question marks about it. Specifically, well, just before we get into that, because I do want to talk about the legal aspects of it, but one thing that I worry about is Congress getting addicted to the money and spending it, or maybe even, not just using it to offset the deficits we already have, but maybe like funding new things or something. Yeah, I mean, how does something like that work into the baseline? Is it, I mean, if Congress gets, I mean, is there a potential that Congress will want to, this money will get woven into the baseline, even though there are some suspect aspects to it?
Well, I think we all know that Congress loves to give away, right? They love to be able to say that they've given things to their constituents, and of course, there's been talk of maybe some sort of a rebate or other means of kind of spending this tariff money. But kind of as we're talking through this, the reality is you can only spend the money once, right? And so you can make the argument that hey, this is offsetting the cost of the tax cuts that were extended, or you can say this is maybe helping reduce the deficit. But if you start allocating this to a third thing, you're over accounting for those dollars, and so you could end up in a situation where things deteriorate even further. And so we certainly want to avoid that. But I think over time, Congress is going to have to take a closer look at these options, and if not these tariffs, looking ahead. We will need to kind of rein in deficits over the long term. And so if not these deficits, then over time, they're going to be looking for other source of saving, whether that's reducing spending in some areas or increasing other taxes. And so, I think tariffs are potentially a piece of the picture if we have, if that's the right way we want to go. But again, I think we'll get into some of the legal basis and how that would have to happen over time.
Yeah, one quick economic point. I mean, there are potentially some economic downsides to the tariffs, are there not? I mean, it is a tax, so somebody's paying it, whether it's the importers or it hasn't seemed to bleed too much into the consumer prices yet, but everybody seems to think it will eventually. So what, I mean, are there some long-term economic downsides to relying on tariffs for your income?
There are absolutely trade-offs involved in using tariffs as a source of revenue, and as you said, there's no free lunch, and supply and demand predict kind of like what happens in a tariff situation, and it might vary sort of industry by industry or sector by sector depending on how much consumers are able to replace or change their behavior, and how much suppliers, businesses are able to either adjust their supply chains and rely more on domestic supply chains versus imported inputs to materials. And so how that factors out into who sort of bears the burden of the tax. It's not necessarily who is remitting the tax or giving the tax over to the Treasury. It's how does the price of goods, imported goods change? Of course, that's reflected or borne by households and families who are purchasing. It could be lower profits for businesses, or it could be reduced hiring, and so there's some of the burden shifted on workers. And so it's really going to depend. As you mentioned in your question, it seems like prices haven't adjusted as fast as maybe we had thought, but there was a lot of front loading of inventories at the beginning of the year, kind of in anticipation of some of this revenue. But as those inventories wind down, as these tariffs are really starting to take effect, I think maybe in the months ahead we'll start to see more just who could bear the burden of these tariffs.
Okay, so the question hanging over all of these tariffs are, for better or for worse, are they even legal? And two federal courts that have looked at it have said no, at least some of them. I mean, we should say that there are a plethora of tariffs that the president has imposed based on different theories, different statutes. So they're not all uniform, but two very large categories are something called the reciprocal tariffs, and then the I guess you could call them the border tariffs or the fentanyl tariffs, but not to get too detailed about it. But the ones that he announced against Canada, China, and Mexico, supposedly in response to a drug emergency of fentanyl coming across the border, and then and those countries being supposedly complicit in that, and then the reciprocal tariffs because of an emergency on a declared emergency on the trade deficit, and that was I don't want to get into all the economics of that, but anyway, there's the two big tranches of the tariffs that we've been talking about. And two federal courts, including the Federal Circuit Court, Federal Appeals Court for the Federal Circuit, have ruled that the president exceeded his authority under the emergency statute that he was using, and now that issue is going to the Supreme Court. So, I mean, basically, what is the legal issue about these tariffs?
So essentially, what the administration for most of these tariffs, they're relying on the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. That's sort of the legal rationale, the basis that the administration has imposed these tariffs on. And as you mentioned, there's sort of the broad-based kind of 10% across the board tariffs that were applied to a lot of countries based on what the president declared was an emergency in terms of just the fairness and practices of our trading policies over time. And then there was sort of the opioid issue. I think that was a lot with Mexico and Canada. What is one of the issues, and I should preface this by saying I'm not a legal expert, and I don't have any inclination of what the Supreme Court is going to say on the issue. But one is whether tariffs are part of the toolkit in IEEPA. I think there's a little bit of ambiguity there in the statute, and then again, secondly, the degree to which the president has relied on this emergency power to impose broad-based tariffs, on many of our trading partners. And so, I think it gets the question, as we talked about earlier in the conversation today around the power of the purse, right? Article 1 gives Congress the power to levy taxes, and most taxes have to originate from Congress and be passed through the legislative process and then signed into law. Whereas, if we're talking about $200 billion a year in tariffs over time, that is a significant amount of taxing power that the executive branch has unilaterally claimed. And so I think that is kind of getting at the tension of what's going on in some of these court cases and what's going to have to be sorted out, eventually at the Supreme Court level.
Yeah, and it's going to come down to a reading of what the phrase "regulate importation" means.
Exactly.
Those are two words in the statute, and if you think that it includes the power to lay tariffs, then the president's okay. If you think that Congress must be more specific if it's going to give away its power to lay tariffs, then you would agree with the Federal Appeals Court that the administration exceeded his authority. But clearly, this is a case that the Supreme Court is going to tell us what they want to do. But it has huge implications because, for one thing, if the tariffs are thrown out, then a lot of people are saying we want refunds. And now, as you're talking about, there's like hundreds of billions of dollars of refunds at stake. So it's a lot of people are watching that. We're going to have to take another break. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm talking with Rachel Snyderman and Caleb Quakenbush of the Bipartisan Policy Center. We'll be right back after these short messages. Welcome back to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and this week I'm talking with Rachel Snyderman and Caleb Quakenbush of the Bipartisan Policy Center. They both work in economic policy there, fiscal policy and economic policy. And I want to turn now to how the markets are reacting to the U.S. government debt. I mean, this is something that folks have begun to watch very closely. There have been some odd things that have happened in the markets this year. When the tariffs were first announced back in April, there was a strange thing where uh, investors seemed to pull away from U.S. Uh, treasuries, and it seemed kind of odd because usually there's people buy treasuries when there's some sort of uncertainty, and so people began wondering: are the markets showing some question about the U.S. as a place to park their funds? So anyway, what Caleb? I know you've been looking at this. Is there a signal that the bond markets are trying to send to us?
Yeah, and I think the story goes back even farther than this April with the bond markets. Looking at the yields, on longer term securities, so 10-year yield, 30-year yields in the Treasury. Now, late last year, the Fed started, kind of easing. It had raised rates, over the course of following the pandemic and the inflation that followed there to try to get, prices under control. But it felt that it was getting to a place where it could, begin to lower rates again and start easing. And often, what you expect is for interest rates to kind of fall. But the Fed, operates more at the short-term part of the market. This kind of 1 month, 1 year rates. But usually longer term rates fall, kind of in tandem. But what we saw is actually on those longer term securities for government borrowing, is rates remain stubbornly high, and those rates often influence other longer term rates in the economy, such as mortgage rates, and those remain stubbornly high at the beginning of the year as well. And one potential signal is that might be sending us is that there is concern about the long-term trajectory of U.S. borrowing over time, where we are, as we talked about, borrowing $2 trillion plus dollars each year from the bond market. There might be a limit to that, and investors are starting to demand essentially a higher return on that. You add on top of that some of the uncertainty and potential long-term inflation that we're looking at, and I think you see some of the signals coming from the bond markets as well, that investors are just going to demand a higher return on their investment, and of course that means higher borrowing costs for the government, higher interest payments for taxpayers, but also potentially higher borrowing costs for businesses and consumers as well.
We were talking about tariffs in the last segment, and seems kind of ironic to me. I mean, when initially the bond markets didn't seem to like the tariffs. When President Trump announced them, it seemed like the uncertainty and trade wars, and people got nervous about it. And now that all this money is coming in from the tariffs, it seems like the bond markets are saying, oh, well, now if the Supreme Court overrules these tariffs, the money is going to go away, and the government's going to be stuck with these big deficits, which we're going to be stuck with anyway, even if we have the tariffs. But anyway, that phenomenon has been recent, that it seems like there's some concern, some affection for the tariffs now in the bond markets. Is that right? Or
markets are famously difficult to fully interpret. I mean, there are so many different parts of the demand curve, right? You have institutional investors, you have people who are more, hedge fund and trying to make money. And so there's probably multiple signals, and people are approaching it from, different aspects according to what their particular investment needs and outlooks are. But I think, again, sort of backing away, parallel to all of this bond market activity, there was a downgrading of the U.S. Debt last year by Moody's, became the third of the major bond markets. And again, what was cited in that downgrade. It was essentially the long-term fiscal outlook for the country and growing entitlement spending, growing deficits, and government's inability to deal with that. And I think some of the signals that are related by investors are also sending is that they're looking ahead and looking at those deficits. And as you mentioned, if not tariffs, then from where? And there doesn't seem to be kind of a clear fiscal picture of how Congress plans to address the debt in the long term.
Well, let me pick up from that, because I think we would all agree that if Congress getting its act together and doing something about the long-term fiscal outlook and the sustainability of the budget would certainly improve the bond market's feeling about the U.S. as a good place for investment, because we do have this hanging over us, as you mentioned. The ratings agencies have reacted poorly to our fiscal outlook. So, what should Congress be doing? This is kind of, I'll go back to Rachel on this, and I'm not asking you what's the plan here, but I mean, are there procedural things? Are there budget process things that we could be doing to help?
I mean, I think that's that's why we are hard at work doing what we do. I mean, I think that this is where Congress needs to recognize that the only way that we are going to change our fiscal outlook is by putting both sides of the budget ledger on the table, that this is not just a revenue or not just a spending issue, but that it does require comprehensive analysis of both sides, and that will require difficult trade-offs. But
well, I mean, do we need another fiscal commission or something like that?
I mean, we've certainly seen bipartisan calls for that over the past few years. Where I think, though, a fiscal commission will ultimately be successful, though, is that we do need the political courage that comes with, taking the necessary step forward to put into law and then act on those laws. Action. They are surrounded by a plethora of good ideas and know the warning signs that they should be looking for, and know some of those trigger points, like the insolvency of the Social Security's primary trust fund, now within a decade away. These are not these are not unknown unknowns. These are we are kind of marching towards just harder issues and harder choices if we fail to take those courageous steps today. And so, whether that be done through a bipartisan fiscal commission, whether that be, what I would like to see this being a bigger focal point in the 2026 elections, for example. There are certainly many turning points that getting voters more jazzed up and energized about the fact that when they are facing those higher grocery costs, it is all circular. It is related to kind of these broader constraints that we are seeing play out in our macro fiscal policy. And so it's going to come down to political courage and leadership there to make those tough choices on behalf of putting us on a stronger fiscal course, and doing so to help taxpayers and voters.
I know BPC recently put out an issue brief about fiscal rules, and you looked at some fiscal rules that other countries have used successfully. Do any of them stand out as a potential model for the U.S.? Jump ball, either one of you.
Caleb, who was at the top of your list there?
Oh, yeah. Well, I know you had Kirk Couchman on very recently, and I know he was talking about some potential fiscal rules there. And you guys talked about, the Swiss debt brake and, some of the trying to balance the budget, kind of over a business cycle, right? They're recognizing that there are ups and downs in the economy that the government will need to respond to, but government needs to be looking at its horizon and balancing the budget, sort of those long-term either balance or maybe even some surplus in some years. So that's one opportunity I think ahead, or one model to look to over time. Of course, we looked at various other rules that have been used by other countries, including a handful of other countries who have used debt limits. United States has a debt limit, although we know from our own experience that hasn't necessarily led to much fiscal
It hasn't
restraint
limited, yeah, despite
on
its
our
name,
part,
it
right?
hasn't limited.
It keeps getting raised. But I think at the end of this article, what we say is some of it. It's not just about the rules, although the rules are important and they form a very important architecture for how decisions get made and framed. But it takes political will, like Rachel was saying, in order to really be committed to making those hard choices, making the trade-offs, and setting ourselves up for success, no matter which kind of rule regime we rely on.
You know, that is a great place to leave it. For one thing, we're out of time, so I have no choice. But otherwise, I think that really is a good message that, Congress can set up all sorts of great rules and try to bind themselves. But if the political will is not there to solve the problem, it's not going to be solved. So, and that's something that we all need to do. You've been listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby, and I've been talking with Rachel Snyderman, Director of Economic Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Caleb Quakenbush, Associate Director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Program. I will be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.